China has dumped over $43 billion in bonds in 2026 alone, and they're using that money aggressively to buy another asset, gold. China's gold reserves are 75.4 million ounces by the end of June 2026, and they're dumping the US dollar at an incredible pace. But to rewind back a little, how did China end up with so much US treasuries in the first place? Well, if Walmart pays a Chinese manufacturer $1 million for their products, the Chinese manufacturer cannot pay his employees with the US dollar. So he goes to the People's Bank of China, exchanges dollar for yuan, and pays his employees. But now the bank is left with $1 million, and the safest place to invest those million US dollars without exchange losses or risk is treasuries. For years, China has ran this trade deficit and invested billions of dollars in the US economy, until in 2013. Well, in 2013, the chairman of Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, said in an interview that the Federal Reserve would soon begin to taper or slow down its massive bond buying program.
Then we could, in the next few meetings, we could take a step down in our pace of purchases.
That very day, the world economy lost their mind. If the biggest buyer of bonds is stepping back, that creates more supply than there is demand, meaning that bonds would lose value overnight. This rapid sell-off of bonds caused the prices to crash and the yield to skyrocket, and investors all over the world scrambled for cash to invest in high-yielding safe assets, the treasuries. But buying and selling of bonds sucked the investment out of emerging markets, especially China. And Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, was watching this very closely, and the power the US dollar has over the whole world economy. That year, China began their journey to dethrone the dollar and offer yuan as an alternative. But the only problem with this strategy was China held over $1.3 trillion in the US bond market, which meant more power to the West. So China slowly began selling bonds as a defensive move to stabilize their economy against the dollar. But the problem was no other asset was as safe as the US treasuries. But that changed in 2022 completely. What started as a defensive move by the Chinese government took an aggressive move in 2022. Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the West, especially the US, froze $300 billion of Russian assets, and the treasuries that looked like a safe haven for these world economies suddenly became a nightmare for Russia. China saw this as a code red situation, because as long as they hold treasuries, as long as they're in the SWIFT system, they will always be obligated to listen to their Western masters. China began an aggressive bond selling program in 2022, selling over $100 billion in bonds by 2024. However, selling bonds and being free from Western control was just half the problem. No other asset in the world offers the depth, the safety, the guaranteed yield that the US treasuries offer, except... Well, the US dollar is a little over 200 years old. The Chinese yuan is a little less than 100 years old. But gold has been traded among nations and civilizations for thousands of years. I mean, take a look at the past 40 years. Gold prices have gone up over 1,000%. And China is not unaware of that. Their gold purchases have been on an all-time high with over 2,300 tons of gold by 2026. They're buying gold at such an unprecedented rate for two reasons. Well, the first, to replace the US-backed treasuries with something the West cannot touch. If they have gold bars logged in Chinese vaults, they're not really affected by Western sanctions, and they can trade goods with other sanctioned nations. But just to prove my point, ever since the Iran war started, China has dumped over $41 billion in treasuries just in March itself. Instead of holding on to digital dollars, they're buying tons of gold every single month. At this rate, China would soon have a system backed by gold, which makes yuan very appealing to other nations for trading, and their endgame would be to create a sanction-proof currency because digital gold cannot be frozen or hacked or deleted.